You know exactly when it happened. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment anyone else would have remembered as significant. There was just a day where something deep inside your psyche completed a calculation it had been running for years and went still, silent, distant, unbreakable in a way no one around you was prepared for. Your empathy did not explode. It did not burn out in some dramatic collapse. It simply, quietly, refused to keep functioning as a furnace for rooms that gave nothing back. People later called this shift coldness. They used the word as an accusation because they could no longer extract their required warmth from you. But Carl Jung understood that this absolute stillness is not coldness. It is the dissolution of a primitive psychological fusion he called participation mystique, the interweaving of your consciousness with the emotional demands of everyone around you, finally, permanently severed. By the end of this video, you will understand the exact psychological architecture of this final shift. You will realize that the silence on this side of the door is not a betrayal of the empathy you once possessed. The people around you are not grieving the loss of your love. They are panicking because you have finally integrated the one psychological structure that makes you impossible to consume. You did not become heartless. Your body made a decision your mind was too loyal to make. But the mechanism that produced this shift, the invisible calculation your psyche ran without your permission, is far more precise and far more ancient than anything you have been told about boundaries or self-care. And understanding it changes how you interpret everything that has happened to you since the day you went quiet. You remember the exact day. You might even remember the exact sentence they said. It was not the worst thing they had ever said to you. That is the part that confuses people when you try to explain it later. It was not a grand betrayal. It was something small, a dismissive comment, a demand disguised as a question, a tone that assumed you would once again metabolize whatever they were feeling and hand it back to them processed and safe. The same tone you have been hearing for 20 years, or 30, or 40. The same assumption, repeated so many times, it wore a groove in you so deep that one more pass of the needle was enough to break the record entirely. But this time, your mind did something it had never done before. It paused. Not the performative pause of someone gathering patience. A genuine, mechanical halt, as though a circuit breaker tripped somewhere below your conscious awareness and the current stopped flowing outward. You did not get angry. You did not cry. You did not even feel the familiar exhaustion of swallowing your own reaction to protect theirs. You felt nothing. Or rather, you felt something so unfamiliar that nothing was the closest word your vocabulary could supply. What you actually felt was the absence of the automatic response. The machinery that had always kicked in, the rushing forward to soothe, to explain, to absorb, did not activate. And in that empty space where your reflexive empathy used to live, there was a silence so vast it frightened you. Jung observed that the unconscious operates with mathematical precision beneath the surface of awareness. When the conscious mind exhausts itself trying to maintain a fiction, when the ego can no longer sustain the performance it has been running for decades, the deeper psyche intervenes. Not gently, not with warning. It overrides the ego the way a fuse blows to prevent a house fire. The organism decides that survival is more important than continuity. Your psyche made an executive decision. It did not consult you. It did not ask if you were ready. It calculated that one more cycle of absorption, one more round of processing someone else's emotional weather through your own nervous system, would cost more than you could afford to pay. And it cut the power supply. This is not metaphor. When the cost of maintaining a posture exceeds the organism's capacity to sustain it, the posture is abandoned, instantaneously, like a bone that has been bending under weight for years, snapping into the position it was meant to hold. You may have felt it as a physical sensation, a sudden loosening in your chest, a heaviness settling into your limbs that was not fatigue but gravity, as though for years you had been floating slightly above your own life, tethered to it only by the strings of obligation, and something cut those strings and let you land inside your own body with your full weight. The landing was not comfortable. It was disorienting, but it was unmistakably real in a way that nothing had been real for years. The people around you noticed immediately, not because you said anything, not because you announced a boundary or delivered a speech about your needs. They noticed because the temperature in the room changed when you were in it. You were no longer radiating. You were no longer leaking warmth in every direction like a furnace with no walls. And the people who had built their emotional comfort on the assumption that you would always be warm, that your warmth was a natural law rather than a finite resource they were burning through, those people felt the chill instantly. But the way this cutoff changes your relationship to the physical room is the part that terrifies the people around you. For years, perhaps decades, you absorbed the emotional weather of every space you entered. You did not choose this. It was not a gift you cultivated or a spiritual talent you developed. It was a survival mechanism. Your nervous system learned very early that reading the room was the difference between safety and danger, a parent's shifting mood, a household where silence meant the storm was coming. You learned to feel everything because missing a signal meant getting hurt, and that vigilance never turned off, even after the original danger was gone. Even now, decades later, if someone across the room is anxious, your chest tightens. If someone at the dinner table is suppressing rage, your stomach clenches. If the person beside you is carrying grief, a heaviness settles over your limbs that does not belong to you, but that your body cannot distinguish from its own. Jung named this condition participation mystique. Not empathy, not compassion. A primitive, unconscious fusion in which two psychic fields interpenetrate and no boundary exists between them. You have been living inside this fusion your entire life without knowing it. Had a name. You were not empathizing with the people around you. You were merged with them. Their pain was literally your pain, not because you are compassionate, but because you never developed the psychological skin that would allow you to experience yourself as separate. No one taught you where you ended and they began. No one told you that what you were doing was not love. It was a survival adaptation that outlived the danger that created it. Jung wrote that liberation occurs when the magical claim of things has ceased because the interweaving of consciousness with world has come to an end. The unconscious is not projected anymore, and so the primordial participation mystique with things is abolished. The fullness of the world, which hitherto pressed upon it, has lost none of its richness and beauty, but it no longer dominates. That passage describes the exact thing that happened to you. The world did not become grey. The people in it did not become irrelevant to you. What changed is the claim they had on your interior life. The magical demand that you match them, mirror them, carry them. That claim evaporated, and in its absence, you discovered something extraordinary. You discovered that the world is actually more vivid when you are not bleeding into it. Colors are sharper when your nervous system is not drowning in someone else's cortisol. Conversations are more interesting when you are not running a parallel process, calculating how to stabilize the other person's mood. Life is richer, not emptier, on this side of the separation. The people who tell you that your detachment means you have lost something beautiful are wrong. You have never seen beauty more clearly than you see it now. You no longer confuse proximity to pain with depth of feeling. Read that last sentence from Jung again. The world does not become less beautiful. The people do not become less real. You do not lose your capacity to perceive their suffering. What you lose is the compulsion to carry it. What dies is not your empathy. What dies is the fusion. the involuntary merging that masqueraded as sensitivity but was actually a failure of psychological differentiation. And the day you went still, the day the circuit breaker tripped, was the day that fusion finally, permanently dissolved. You sat across from the same anxious, demanding people you had always sat across from. You heard their words. You perceived their emotional state with the same accuracy you always had. But for the first time in your life, your internal temperature did not rush to match theirs. You remained entirely, impossibly yourself. The terror of that moment is something only you understand, because it felt like a death. The self you had always been, the self who rushed in, the self who could not rest until everyone in the room was stabilized, that self was gone. And in its place was a quiet, heavy presence you did not recognize. You tested it. You waited for the old response to return. Someone in your life was in distress, and you sat with the distress in the room, waiting for the familiar flood, the tightening in your throat, the compulsive need to fix. It did not come. Minutes passed. The other person's pain remained entirely theirs. Your body remained entirely yours. Separate, intact, boundaried in a way you had never experienced while conscious. And you realized, with a mixture of awe and mourning, that this was what other people felt like all the time. This was the baseline you had never been permitted. This ordinary, unremarkable experience of sitting in a room with another human being without absorbing their weather was something the rest of the world took for granted. And you were feeling it for the first time at 30 or 40 or 50 years old. A presence that observed without intervening, that witnessed without absorbing, that saw the storm and felt no compulsion to stand in the rain. If you have spent your life absorbing the emotional weather of every room you entered, and one day your system refused to do it anymore, if that refusal terrified you because it felt like you were losing the thing that made you good, write this in the comments. I stopped absorbing. I am still here. We will come back to the exact mechanism your mind used to build this new skin. Because what it constructed in the dark, while you were still trying to understand why you felt so different, is the very thing that makes you permanently untouchable to the people who used to feed on your fusion. But first, you need to understand what happens when the people who relied on your permeability discover that the door no longer opens from the outside. They try to pull you back. They always try. The first few weeks, perhaps months, after the shift are not peaceful. They are a sustained assault on the new structure your psyche has built, because the people who relied on your permeability do not accept its end quietly. They escalate. The guilt trips arrive first, subtle, carefully calibrated. They tell you they miss who you used to be. They frame their grief not as the loss of access to your energy, but as concern for your well-being. They ask if something is wrong. They suggest therapy. They imply that this new version of you is damaged, broken, in need of repair. Because the only explanation they can tolerate for your withdrawal is that something has gone wrong with you. The alternative, that you have finally gone right, is unbearable to them. Then come the manufactured crises, the emergencies that previously guaranteed your participation, the phone call at midnight, the tearful confession timed perfectly to coincide with the moment you seemed most resolved, the sudden collapse of a situation they had plenty of time to address but chose not to, because they knew that your compulsion to rescue would override any boundary you attempted to set. But this time, you watch the machinery operate. You see the crisis arriving. You perceive the manipulation with a clarity that was never available to you when you were inside the fusion. And you feel nothing, not cruelty, not satisfaction, just the absence of the old urgency. The fire is burning. They are pointing at it, and you do not jump. You notice something extraordinary about your own body in these moments. Your heart rate does not spike. Your breathing does not shallow. The cortisol flood that used to drown your nervous system every time someone near you was in distress does not come. Your biology has recalibrated. The threat response that was welded to other people's emotions has mercifully decoupled. And in this decoupled state, you can see the drama for what it actually is. Not an emergency, a pattern. A loop they have been running for years, possibly decades, with you cast in the role of rescue. A role you never auditioned for, but performed so reliably that everyone forgot it was never your job. You watch the loop play out. You see the escalation, the peak, the point where they turn to you with that familiar expectation in their eyes. And you remain where you are, unmoved, not because you lack compassion, because you understand now that your intervention was never helping them. It was preventing them from ever learning to carry their own weight. Every time you jumped into the fire, you were not saving them. You were teaching them that fire has no consequences, because you would always be there to absorb the burn. Jung described this exact shift as the view from the mountaintop. He wrote that what, on a lower level, had led to the wildest conflicts and to panicky outbursts of emotion, from the higher level of personality, now looked like a storm in the valley, seen from the mountaintop. This does not mean that the storm is robbed of its reality, but instead of being in it, one is above it. You have not become numb. You know the difference because you have been numb before, and this is not that. Numbness was the shutdown that came after years of carrying too much. This is something else entirely. You perceive everything you always perceived. You see the storm as clearly as you ever did, but you are no longer possessed by it. You are watching it from an altitude that allows you to see its full shape, its beginning and end, its pattern and repetition, without being swept away by any individual gust. You are above it now, not because you are superior to them, not because their suffering is not real, but because your consciousness has reached an altitude from which the drama that previously consumed you can be observed without participation. You see the storm. You acknowledge its violence. You do not deny the rain, but you are no longer standing in it, soaked through and shivering, trying to build an umbrella large enough to cover everyone who refuses to come inside. If you are recognizing yourself in this pattern, if you have watched the storm from the mountain and felt for the first time no compulsion to descend into it, the Alchemist's Path was written for exactly this moment. It gives you Jung-based boundary drills, perception training for empaths, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn that recognition into a practice you can use. 236 pages, downloadable now at thesurrealmind.com, and this absolute refusal to participate triggers the accusation you have been dreading. The accusation arrives, and it arrives wearing a mask. It comes dressed as concern, but its architecture is punishment. They tell you that you have changed, that you are distant, that something is wrong with you. They use the word cold, and they mean it as a diagnosis. This is the same mechanism that has been used against you your entire life. You saw clearly. You were told you were wrong. You felt accurately. You were told you were too much. You perceived the truth of a dynamic. You were told you were imagining things. And now, your stillness is being treated with the same denial. Your health is being framed as your dysfunction. Because the people who benefited from your wound have never once acknowledged that the wound existed. The vocabulary escalates in proportion to how firmly you hold your ground. Cold becomes selfish. Selfish becomes cruel. Cruel becomes dangerous. And each word is selected with surgical precision to activate your oldest wound, the terror of being unlovable if you are not useful. They know on some level beneath language exactly which word will make you fold. They have been calibrating this vocabulary your entire life. And here is the part they will never admit. The reason their vocabulary is so precisely calibrated is because they have been studying you for as long as you have been studying them. The difference is that your study was motivated by love. Theirs was motivated by access. You learned their emotional landscape so you could navigate it without causing harm. They learned yours so they could navigate it to ensure supply. The asymmetry of that exchange is the thing you were never supposed to see clearly. And now that you see it, now that the altitude has given you the full map of the terrain, you cannot unsee it. And you will not go back down into the valley because they are calling your name from inside the storm. Jung warned that this would happen. He wrote that the development of personality is at once a charisma and a curse, because its first fruit is the conscious and unavoidable segregation of the single individual from the undifferentiated and unconscious herd. The herd does not celebrate when one of its members wakes up. It does not applaud your individuation. It experiences your consciousness as a threat to its continuation, because the herd can only function when its members remain unconscious, when they agree to suppress their individual truth in service of collective comfort. You were a member of this herd. You paid your dues in swallowed reactions and absorbed pain and boundaries you let dissolve, because the alternative felt like exile. You earned your place by being essential to the group's emotional regulation. You were the thermostat they never had to install because your body did the work for free. You were the shock absorber between people who could not handle the impact of each other's sharpness. You were the translator who converted ugly truths into palatable fictions so that everyone could pretend the dysfunction was manageable. And now that you have stepped outside, now that you have separated yourself from the undifferentiated mass of people who required your unconsciousness for their comfort, they are treating your awakening as an act of war. They do not miss you. They miss the utility of your endless absorption. They are calling you cold because you shut the window, and they are freezing. And for the first time in your life, their discomfort is not something you feel compelled to solve. Notice how the accusation always frames your healing as a loss of something valuable, rather than the gaining of something necessary. They never say, "You have become whole." They say, "You have become hard." They never acknowledge that the softness they are mourning was actually a wound that refused to close. They frame your scar tissue as a character flaw because your open wound was so much more convenient for them. You sit with this accusation, and you feel something you have never felt before in the face of their disappointment. Nothing. Not defiance, not guilt, not the frantic need to prove that you are still good, still loving, still worthy of being kept. Just a vast, quiet nothing. An emptiness that is not deprivation, but space. Room you have never had before. Room to be what you are without performing it for an audience. You do not need to defend yourself, because the defense would require you to re-enter the fusion. It would require you to care what they think of you, more than you care about the architecture that is keeping you alive, and you have crossed a threshold where that exchange is no longer possible. The building they want you back inside was never your home. It was theirs. They wanted you in it because your body burned slower. You realize, slowly, in the weeks and months after the accusations begin, that you are not broken, you are not damaged, you are not the villain they need you to be. You feel a heavy, grounded sensation in your own bones that was never available to you before. A physical weight, a density, as though for your entire life you were a translucent, insubstantial thing, easily passed through, easily compressed into whatever shape the room required. And now, finally, you have substance. Jung called this the assimilation of the shadow. He wrote that wholeness is not so much perfection as completeness. That assimilation of the shadow gives a man body, so to speak. The animal's sphere of instinct, as well as the primitive or archaic psyche, emerge into the zone of consciousness and can no longer be repressed by fictions and illusions. The fiction was your harmlessness. The illusion was your infinite patience. The shadow you integrated was the part of you capable of absolute, unyielding severance. The blade you always carried, but never allowed yourself to acknowledge. You were told your entire life that gentleness was your defining quality, that your willingness to be consumed was a virtue, that the absence of sharp edges made you good. And you believed it. You believed it so thoroughly that when the edges finally emerged, when the blade came up from the dark, you mistook it for a disease, rather than a homecoming. But the blade was always yours. It was always part of you. It was buried under decades of conditioning that told you sharp things were dangerous, and dangerous things were bad, and bad things meant you would be alone. Your shadow was not your cruelty. Your shadow was your capacity to protect yourself, exiled into the unconscious because the people around you needed you defenseless. And this integration, this gaining of body, brings you to the final territory, the place you have been afraid to name because naming it means admitting that you are never going back. You are not grieving who you were. You are not mourning the warm, absorbing, endlessly available version of yourself that the people around you keep demanding back. You feel a dark, heavy satisfaction in knowing that version is dead, and you are not ashamed of the satisfaction, because the version they miss was never whole. It was a ghost, a permeable, insubstantial phantom that could be walked through, breathed through, occupied by anyone who needed shelter inside someone else's warmth. The version you have become is different. It has walls. It has weight. It has the specific gravity of a person who has accepted that they are allowed to take up space without apologizing for the displacement. When someone accuses you of being cold, you do not rush to prove your warmth. You let the accusation hang in the air, sustained by your own unshakable mass. You do not argue against it. You do not explain. You continue being exactly what you are, which is whole. The harmless empath was a fiction maintained by everyone who benefited from your lack of structure. By integrating your shadow, by allowing the dark, defensive, fiercely self-protective instinct to enter your conscious personality, you gained the psychological weight necessary to withstand any attempt to consume you again. You are not cold. You are solid. You are not distant. You are finally located inside your own body, instead of scattered across the emotional fields of everyone who needed you dispersed. You did not lose your empathy. You rescued it from people who were using it as a commodity. This is the first time your empathy has ever been yours to give, rather than theirs to take. The difference is everything. When your warmth was involuntary, when it leaked out of you without your consent, it was not generosity, it was a hemorrhage. Now that the wound is closed, now that your warmth exists inside, a structure with walls and a door, you can choose where it goes. You can choose who receives it. You can choose to sit in a room full of aching people and remain entirely, perfectly, sovereignly still. The door did not slam. It simply closed, quietly, permanently, sealing the architecture that was always waiting underneath your compliance, underneath your permeability, underneath every year you spent functioning as an emotional commons for people who never paid rent. The people who cannot tolerate this version of you were never standing beside you. They were standing inside you, occupying space that belonged to you. And now that you have filled your own body with your own substance, there is no room for them anymore. Not because you pushed them out, because you moved in. You did not lose who you were. You lost who they needed you to be. And on this side of the door, in this sovereign quiet, you are breathing air that belongs only to you for the first time in your life. Your silence is no longer survival. It is choice. Your solitude is no longer exile. It is architecture. There is a grief here, and you are allowed to feel it. Not grief for what you lost, but grief for how long you lived without this. Grief for the years you spent dispersed across other people's emotional landscapes, never knowing what it felt like to gather all of yourself into one place and exist as a single, undivided thing. You are grieving the decades of absence from your own life, The years you spent present for everyone except yourself. And that grief is clean. It does not pull you backward. It moves through you like weather and leaves the air clearer behind it. The stillness is not a wound. It is not a scar. It is not the aftermath of damage. It is the structure, the one that was always there, the one you could never feel because you were too busy being the temperature of everyone else's room to notice you had a room of your own. You are not cold. You are finally climate-controlled. And the people shivering outside your new walls are not shivering because you did something cruel. They are shivering because, for the first time in their lives, they have to generate their own warmth. That was always their responsibility. You carried it for so long that they forgot it was theirs. Let them remember. Let them shiver. Let them learn what you learned decades ago, that warmth costs something, that survival is work, that no one is entitled to the fire inside someone else's body because they refuse to build their own. You paid that price alone, in the dark, for years. Their turn has finally come, and you are allowed, fully and without guilt, to watch them face it from the other side of a closed door. In the Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you will turn this recognition into a daily practice with Jung-inspired boundary drills, step-by-step perception training, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages. Beautifully designed, downloadable now. Begin your training today at thesurrealmind.com.